The Pacific Ocean, late 1944. Midnight. The sea was black and heavy, a slow, rolling darkness stretching beyond sight. From the surface, a faint metallic glimmer drifted between the waves. It blinked once, then again. Inside the Japanese submarine, I-36, tension hung like the stale air. The crew watched their sonar scope, uncertain. The officer of the deck squinted through the periscope, whispering a single word. Buoy. They surfaced quietly, engines idling. A small team stepped out into the cold night, the wind carrying the smell of diesel and salt. The object floated nearby, a metal sphere, strange wires trailing into the water. No markings, no sound, only that faint, pulsing light. Moments later, from somewhere beyond the horizon, a distant hum grew louder. The sound of engines, American aircraft sweeping low. The men froze. One of them muttered, "They can hear us." The officer gave the order, "Dive." As the sub slipped beneath the surface, they understood. The ocean, their greatest ally, had turned against them. The silence of the Pacific was no longer theirs. By 1943, Japan's silent fleet was running out of silence. The Imperial Navy's submarine force, once one of the most advanced and feared in the world, was collapsing under the weight of a changing war. In 1941 and 1942, Japanese submarines had ranged across the Pacific with freedom and audacity. They hunted Allied convoys near Australia, stalked the American West Coast, and shadowed carrier task forces in distant seas. Some had even delivered midget subs to Pearl Harbor, the boldest undersea strike attempt in modern history. But that era of freedom was ending. The loss at Midway in June 1942 had already shifted the balance of power. American carriers, once crippled and scattered, returned in strength. Radar appeared on destroyers. Long-range patrol aircraft, equipped with radar and magnetic anomaly detectors, began sweeping the ocean like a net. The vast Pacific that once shielded Japan had become a vast exposure. Japanese submarines were never built for defense. They were long, elegant, and powerful, designed for distant patrols, not convoy escort. They carried deck guns, reconnaissance planes, even chitin suicide torpedoes later in the war. But they were slow to dive, lacked sonar, and had limited radar warning. Against the rising tide of American technology, they were relics of a fading doctrine, an oceanic cavalry in an age of machines. Fuel was another enemy. By late 1943, Japan's oil supply lines were strangled by U.S. submarines cutting through the East Indies routes. Every gallon counted. Submarine patrols shortened. Missions turned desperate. Supply runs to garrisons in New Guinea, rescue operations for downed pilots, or reconnaissance for phantom carrier fleets that no longer existed. The Imperial Navy could no longer afford to waste submarines on offense. Inside the cramped steel hulls, the men of Japan's submarine corps endured hunger, exhaustion, and a growing sense of futility. Food was rationed to the ounce. Fresh air was a luxury. Diesel fumes and condensation coated everything in a greasy film. Many boats spent weeks without surfacing during daylight. Radio silence was constant. Even the sound of the ocean, once comforting, had become a threat. For every noise could be heard by something unseen. The Americans had learned. In 1943, Admiral Ernest King's orders were clear: absolute dominance of the sea, above and below. U.S. submarines would choke Japan's lifelines, while destroyers and aircraft would clear the depths of any Japanese resistance. The hunter-killer concept, pairing destroyers with aircraft for coordinated anti-submarine warfare, became standard. Each Japanese submarine sunk was not just a loss of men, but a loss of eyes and ears. The Empire's ability to see beyond the horizon was vanishing. Meanwhile, within Japan's naval general staff, reports grew darker. Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, then Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, acknowledged in late 1943 that American detection capabilities had become beyond expectation. Yet few truly understood how far that had gone. Because by late 1944, the Americans had gone further than radar, further than sonar. They had placed listening ears in the sea itself. Floating in silence, carried by waves, these small, unremarkable devices could hear propellers hundreds of meters below. They could talk to aircraft circling above. They were called Sonar Buoys, and their arrival would change the ocean forever. In early 1944, the United States Navy began fighting a new kind of war. One fought not only with ships and men, but with sound. Across laboratories in San Diego, Massachusetts, and Pearl Harbor, engineers and physicists were working on a breakthrough that could hear what the human ear could not. The device was simple in appearance: a watertight cylinder, a float, and a wire that descended into the deep. At its tip, a hydrophone sensitive enough to detect the faint churn of a submarine propeller. Once dropped from an aircraft, it would drift silently, listening, transmitting what it heard by radio. They called it the Sonar Buoy. To the air crews of the U.S. Navy, it was a miracle of technology. A pilot could drop a line of buoys across an area of suspicion and listen through headphones for the signature hum of an engine below. Each buoy transmitted on a unique frequency, allowing entire patterns to be monitored at once. The sea, once a blind expanse, became a grid of sound. Sonar Buoys worked best in cooperation, with radar-equipped patrol bombers like the PV-1 Ventura and the newer PB-4Y Taurus II Privateer. These aircraft could patrol thousands of square miles of ocean daily. Their crews trained to detect periscopes, oil slicks, or faint radar echoes. Once a contact was suspected, a pattern of sonar buoys was dropped. Within minutes, the pilot would know if a submarine was truly there, and if it was moving. For the Japanese, this development was catastrophic. Their submarines had been designed under an entirely different philosophy: range and offensive power over stealth and survivability. Unlike German U-boats, few Japanese vessels carried advanced sonar or radar detection gear. They relied on silence and distance, weapons that no longer worked when the ocean itself was wired to listen. By mid-1944, the U.S. Navy's anti-submarine network extended from Hawaii to the Philippines. Escort carriers and destroyers operated together as hunter-killer groups. Aircraft, guided by radar and sonar buoys, could pursue a single submarine for hours without losing track. In some sectors, the Pacific had become a trap of invisible geometry. Overlapping sound fields, radar arcs, and patrol grids that no human could escape once detected. Japanese naval intelligence received the first reports of this phenomenon with disbelief. In July 1944, intercepted communications from submarines in the Marianas and Caroline Islands spoke of floating radios that seemed to summon American aircraft moments after being sighted. Commanders dismissed these as coincidence, perhaps bad luck, or spies aboard the fleet. But as more submarines vanished without trace, the pattern became undeniable. The Americans had turned the ocean into a sensor. This was the culmination of years of investment. Beginning in 1942, the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ordnance and Western Electric had partnered to create the first practical expendable sonar buoy, known as ANCRT-1. By 1944, thousands were in mass production. Factories in Illinois and New Jersey produced them faster than Japan could replace lost submarines. For every one vessel the Empire sent to sea, there were hundreds of listening buoys waiting to hear it. The Japanese response came too late. Efforts to develop radar countermeasures or silent running propellers were stymied by material shortages and the collapse of research infrastructure. The Empire's industrial capacity, once proud, was disintegrating under relentless bombing. Every week brought fewer submarines, fewer trained crews, and less fuel to run them. By autumn 1944, the truth had reached even the upper echelons of command in Tokyo. Reports described submarines detected within minutes of surfacing, even at night, even without radio transmissions. It was as if the ocean itself was whispering their position. And so, one night that winter, when a Japanese submarine surfaced to investigate a strange metal buoy blinking in the dark, they were not just discovering an American device. They were discovering that their war beneath the sea was already lost. Inside a Japanese submarine in 1944, life was measured in breaths. Every man aboard knew that one mistake, one careless sound, 1 second too long above the surface, could mean death. The air was thick, heavy with oil and sweat. When diesel engines ran, the heat was suffocating. When submerged, condensation dripped from the ceiling like rain. The men slept in turns in bunks shared between shifts. Food spoiled quickly. Rice turned sour, and fresh water was rationed to cups per day. But the greatest burden was silence. Japanese submariners were trained to speak little, move softly, and even avoid coughing. In calm seas, the sound of a dropped wrench could echo through water like a bell. The ocean was no longer empty. It was listening. Letters from home rarely reached them. Many crews went to sea knowing they might never surface again. The Imperial Navy treated submarine duty as an honor. But by 1944, it had become a sentence. Entire crews vanished without record. Wives and families received no notice, only absence. Still, they endured. They believed in the Empire, in duty, and in the samurai legacy the Navy invoked at every ceremony. But beneath those ideals lay exhaustion and fear. The men had seen the Americans adapt faster than they could comprehend. They watched destroyers appear from the mist, perfectly aligned with their course, as if guided by unseen hands. They didn't yet know those hands were electronic, mathematical, American. And somewhere between that faith and fear, the spirit of Japan's submarine corps began to break. The American sonobuoy was not a weapon. Not directly. It didn't explode, didn't chase its prey. It listened. But in the new geometry of warfare, listening was lethal. Each buoy contained a small hydrophone suspended beneath a floating radio transmitter. Once dropped from an aircraft, it activated automatically. The device converted underwater vibrations into radio signals, which were picked up by the plane's receivers. Operators could interpret the tones, steady hums, rhythmic beats, faint echoes, and tell if a submarine was nearby, its distance, even its direction of travel. This was the power of the ANCRT-1, the first mass-produced American Sonar Buoy. Cheap, expendable, and devastatingly effective. Before it, submarine detection was an art, uncertain and slow. After it, it became a science. U.S. aircraft could deploy dozens of these buoys in a single mission. Destroyers, guided by the returning signals, would close in and fire depth charges with precision. The Japanese had no countermeasure. They lacked electronic warfare capability, and their boats couldn't jam or mask the low-frequency sounds of their own propellers. For the Americans, it was a silent revolution. The Navy's Anti-Submarine Command, based in Pearl Harbor, began mapping ocean sectors using buoy data, sound channels, temperature layers, and current drift patterns. It was the birth of acoustic intelligence, decades before the term was coined. And beneath that innovation lay an industrial truth. The United States had the means to mass-produce complexity. While Japan's engineers struggled to keep pace, American factories built thousands of buoys, radars, and sonar systems every month. The technological war at sea was no longer about bravery. It was about who could hear first and who could react faster. On the surface, the Pacific still looked infinite, but by late 1944, it was no longer an ocean. It was a grid. American anti-submarine tactics had evolved into a synchronized ballet of machines. Aircraft scouted by radar, marking probable contacts. Sonar Buoys listened for confirmation. Destroyers triangulated, closing in with sonar and weapons ready. Every move was coordinated, every echo interpreted. The hunter-killer group became the embodiment of this new warfare. A small escort carrier, a handful of destroyers, and patrol bombers operated together in real time, each feeding data to the others. When a Japanese submarine was spotted, it rarely escaped. Between 1943 and 1945, the United States sank over 120 Japanese submarines, most in encounters where detection happened before the submarine could even dive. In contrast, Japan's submarine fleet achieved almost nothing by this stage of the war. Missions to attack American shipping failed because the ocean's new reality favored detection, not stealth. Japanese commanders tried to adapt, changing patrol zones, using radio silence, diving deeper. None of it mattered. The Americans had the advantage of information. This was the real turning point of the Pacific Undersea War. Not one of courage or firepower, but of sensing. The Japanese fought in 3 dimensions, but the Americans fought in 4. Time. When a submarine was detected, the Americans already knew where it was going, how long it could stay submerged, and where it would surface next. The hunter-killer pattern exploited mathematics, timing, and pressure, until every Japanese vessel that left port was stepping into an invisible trap. And somewhere within those calculations, beneath the mechanical precision and human fatigue, the ocean itself began to feel smaller. By late 1944, the Japanese Naval General Staff was fighting 2 wars, one against the United States and one against disbelief. Reports from surviving submarine captains painted a picture the admirals refused to accept. Commanders wrote of floating devices that call down aircraft, of being hunted in hours, not days, of invisible detection far from any patrol line. To men raised in the doctrine of the Imperial Navy, that courage and initiative could overcome technology, this was almost heresy. Vice Admiral Takeo Takagi, among the few to study American operations seriously, warned that Japan's undersea forces were being defeated by science, not by men. But his warnings found little traction in Tokyo. Senior staff clung to older notions of spirit and willpower, convinced that new tactics or bravery could reclaim the sea. This cultural blindness proved fatal. While American commanders like Admiral Charles Lockwood and Captain J.L. Holloway coordinated submarine intelligence with cutting-edge research from the Naval Research Laboratory, Japan's staff meetings debated morale. Fuel shortages restricted training. Sonar technology, though understood, was underdeveloped due to lack of materials. And the few radar detectors that did reach the fleet were unreliable and quickly outdated. Takagi's post-war writings describe the frustration of those months, watching brave men die not for lack of courage, but for lack of understanding. "We were sending swords against thunder," he later wrote, "and no one wished to hear the thunder was real." The leadership gap between belief and reality doomed the submarine corps as surely as depth charges. The Americans had mastered a new dimension of war, while Japan still fought in the old one. From the American side, the change was quiet but absolute. To a U.S. Navy patrol crew, a Japanese submarine was no longer an invisible predator. It was a signature in a field of data. By 1944, U.S. naval intelligence had built an extensive tracking system. Submarine transmissions, intercepted by radio direction finding stations from Hawaii to Australia, were plotted across maps daily. Combined with aircraft patrol reports and buoy detections, the result was near-total situational awareness across entire ocean sectors. In practice, this meant that when a Japanese submarine surfaced to send even a brief message, its location could be triangulated within hours. American hunter-killer groups were often waiting before the submarine reached its next waypoint. For the men aboard U.S. ships, it felt almost clinical. An aircraft would drop Sonar Buoys in a pattern, listening for the telltale beat of propellers. Once contact was confirmed, destroyers moved in. Hydrophone operators tracked echoes, adjusting for depth and speed. Then came the order: fire depth charges. The sea erupted. Moments later, oil and debris surfaced. Confirmation of a kill. Few of those crews saw their enemies' faces. To them, each sinking was another mark on the board, another step toward victory. But within the Navy's intelligence offices, a realization was growing that the nature of warfare itself had shifted. The United States was no longer just fighting battles. It was managing an information network that extended across half the globe. The Pacific had become the first data-driven battlefield in history. Inside the submarines that survived those months, a silence deeper than the ocean settled in. The men began to understand that they were not just losing battles. They were losing the sea itself. To the Japanese sailor, the Pacific was sacred. It had carried the empire's power, its trade, and its faith for generations. To fight beneath it was an act of devotion. But now, that same sea seemed to betray them. Every surfacing brought danger. Every sound echoed back as death. Even the act of listening to the ocean, once an instinct, became a reminder that something unseen was always listening to survivors. Later spoke of the feeling as Yami no Umi, the dark sea. Not just the physical darkness of the depths, but the spiritual one. A realization that human skill, honor, and bravery meant nothing against an enemy that fought with machines, mathematics, and patience. Some captains chose suicide missions, carrying Caton torpedoes in desperate hope of balance. Others followed orders, running silent until fuel and hope ran dry. There were no victories left, only endurance. In the final months of the war, a few submarines still slipped through the American net, but even they returned to find their bases bombed, their fuel gone, their country burning. The sea they had once ruled now belonged to another empire, one of circuits, sensors, and endless resources. The silence they had once trusted had turned against them, and soon that silence would be broken forever. In one fateful encounter, when a Japanese crew finally understood what was listening beneath the waves. Philippine Sea. November 1944. Tersithi. Submarine I-36 was returning from a reconnaissance mission off Leyte Gulf. Her crew was exhausted. The battle for the Philippines had turned the ocean into chaos. American carriers, destroyers, and patrol bombers filled every horizon. Captain Kudo Kiyoshi ordered his men to steer eastward, away from the invasion routes, hoping to slip back to Japan unseen. But the sea no longer obeyed hope. At 300 hours, while running on the surface under moonlight, a lookout spotted something drifting ahead, small, metallic, bobbing in the waves. "Mine?" one sailor whispered. "No," said another. "Too small." The submarine slowed. The captain raised his binoculars. It was a steel sphere, half submerged, with a short antenna glinting under the moon. It blinked faintly, a light, rhythmic, deliberate. They had never seen such a thing. Kudo ordered a cautious approach. The men fished the object aboard with a hook, dragging it onto the deck. It was surprisingly light, cylindrical beneath, with an internal hum. No fuse, no writing, just the faint whine of electronics. Before they could examine it further, the sound came. A distant drone. Engines growing louder. "Aircraft!" shouted the lookout. The captain's face hardened. "Submerge! Now!" Within seconds, I-36 plunged beneath the surface, ballast tanks hissing, lights dimming to red. The depth gauge spun past 30 meters. 50, 70. Then, ping. It came faintly through the hull, a metallic pulse, mechanical and cold. The sonar operator froze. "Surf's multiple pings, bearing 30 degrees. Closing." The Americans were not guessing. They were following. Above, a U.S. Navy PB-4Y-1 Liberator was circling, guided by the very buoy I-36 had disturbed. Each engine note, each propeller turn below was being heard, measured, and triangulated. Moments later, the ocean shook with the first depth charges. The crew gripped their stations as the submarine rocked violently. Lights flickered, rivets groaned. One man muttered a prayer, unheard over the rumbling blasts. Kudo ordered silent running, engines off, batteries only. The sub glided downward, trying to vanish into the thermocline, the layer of colder water that could sometimes hide them from sonar. But even that layer was not safe anymore. The Americans had learned to adjust their sonar frequencies to penetrate it. More explosions. Closer. Inside, sweat and condensation ran down every face. The oxygen was thinning. The hydrophone operator whispered, "They are circling us." The sound? "It's above and behind." The captain said nothing. He knew what was happening. The aircraft had dropped additional buoys, creating a triangle of detection around them. Every move they made, every turn of the propeller, was being mapped in real time. The noise outside faded, then returned, a pattern of hunting. The Liberator coordinated with a destroyer approaching from miles away, guided by radio from the Sonar Buoys. For the first time in naval history, a submarine was being hunted not by sight or chance, but by sound geometry. After 2 hours of pursuit, the destroyer's sonar found them. The water thundered again, depth charges tearing through the black. One cracked near the stern, extinguishing lights and killing power. The submarine lurched, falling uncontrolled until the ballast was corrected manually. Several men were injured. One was killed instantly by a flying fragment. When silence returned, it was worse than the explosions. The captain stood in darkness, listening to the distant hums. He knew what it meant. The Americans were not searching blindly anymore. The sea itself was guiding them. For the next 6 hours, I-36 remained motionless, lying on the seafloor. When they finally surfaced at dawn, the buoy was gone. So were the aircraft. The ocean seemed calm again, but no one spoke. The crew realized they had survived not by skill, but by being beneath the Americans' interest. The machines above had moved on to another contact. Captain Kudo wrote in his log that day, "We encountered a new device. It listens, it signals, it summons the enemy. The sea has become their ally. Ours no longer." That report, when received at 6th Fleet Headquarters in Kure, was met with disbelief and dread, because this time the evidence was undeniable. When I-36's report reached the Naval General Staff in Tokyo, it landed like a ghost message. The document was brief, clinical, almost subdued. Enemy has developed floating radio listening devices. These may summon aircraft rapidly after detection. No one could explain how such a thing worked. No one wanted to believe it could. Admiral Shigeru Fukudome read the report twice, then ordered silence. The findings were classified as Tokubetsu Gijutsu, special technology. In the months that followed, other submarines, I-41, RO-43, I-48 sent similar warnings. Crews spoke of small buoys drifting near their paths, followed soon by aircraft and destroyers. Many of those submarines never returned. American patrol bombers now operated freely up to the Japanese coastline. The hunter-killer groups, supported by escort carriers, had pushed the front line to Japan's doorstep. In March 1945, during the Okinawa campaign, U.S. forces sank 8 Japanese submarines in a single month. The once mighty Sixth Fleet, the pride of Japan's undersea command, had effectively ceased to exist. To the Imperial Navy, the losses went beyond material. They shattered a century of naval tradition built on the idea that mastery of the sea defined national destiny. Since Admiral Togo's victory at Tsushima in 1905, Japan had believed its sailors could triumph through discipline and courage, even against superior numbers. But courage could not hear sonar. Discipline could not outthink electronics. Post-war analyses by the U.S. Navy confirmed what the Japanese had already learned the hard way. The undersea war had become a contest of sensors, not souls. Where Japan relied on intuition, the U.S. relied on measurement. Where Japan sought honor in attack, America found victory in data. The outcome was not just military defeat, it was an epistemological one. A clash between a warrior's ocean and a scientist's ocean. The former had drowned beneath the latter. By the time Emperor Hirohito announced surrender in August 1945, only a handful of Japanese submarines were still afloat, and most were too damaged or fuel-starved to sail. They surfaced under white flags, their crews gaunt and silent, their boats scarred by depth charges and exhaustion. The sea around them was calm, but it no longer belonged to them. When the war ended in August 1945, the surviving officers of Japan's submarine corps returned to a homeland unrecognizable. The ports at Kure, Sasebo, and Yokosuka were shattered ruins. Dry docks lay filled with twisted steel. Half-sunken submarines, stripped of insignia, rested in the shallows, mute witnesses to a vanished world. For the men who had lived beneath the ocean, defeat carried a special weight. They had fought in silence, in darkness, and now, in the aftermath, they faced an unbearable clarity. The Pacific, once their shield, their frontier, had been turned into an American instrument. In the months after surrender, Allied technical teams arrived to study the remains of Japan's submarine program. What they found astonished them. The Imperial Navy had possessed remarkable imagination. Long-range subs that could launch aircraft, massive supply vessels, even underwater aircraft carriers like the I-400 class. But it was a vision of power built on outdated assumptions. For all their daring designs, the Japanese had almost no understanding of modern sonar physics, electronic detection, or acoustic camouflage. The Americans, by contrast, had fought a scientific war. Captured reports revealed the scale of coordination between the U.S. Navy and research institutions: Bell Labs, Harvard, MIT, Columbia, the University of California. Each had contributed to what would later be called the acoustic chain, the fusion of sonar, radar, radio, and computation into a single system of perception. That chain had rendered Japanese submarines obsolete before their captains ever knew it existed. In post-war interrogations, surviving officers admitted they had underestimated American science. Admiral Takagi, speaking to U.S. investigators in 1946, stated plainly, "Our submarines were brave. Yours were intelligent. We could not fight intelligence with bravery." It was a moment of painful honesty and a glimpse into the future. Because from those technologies, the sonobuoy, the sonar network, the hunter-killer doctrine, emerged the foundation of Cold War anti-submarine warfare. By 1949, The United States had refined its wartime systems into the SOSUS network, an ocean-wide array of listening stations designed to track submarines across entire oceans. The same principle that had hunted I-36 now watched Soviet fleets across the world. For Japan, the lesson was existential. In the decades that followed, its rebuilt maritime self-defense force would adopt sonar and anti-submarine systems modeled after American technology. The nation that had once hidden beneath the waves would now learn to listen to them. Among the few surviving submariners, memory remained heavy. They spoke not of glory, but of silence. The oppressive quiet of the deep, broken only by the mechanical heartbeat of sonar pings. Many described it as the moment they understood the future of war, one where courage mattered less than comprehension, and where the ocean itself had become an instrument of intelligence. In one of the final interviews before his death, former Petty Officer Nobuo Nishimura, who served aboard RO-109, said softly, "We thought the sea would protect us, but it told them where we were." He looked out across the calm water of Hiroshima Bay and added, "The sea forgets nothing." The war beneath the waves had ended, but its echoes continued through every hydrophone, every sonar buoy, every ship that still listens to the deep. The silence of the Pacific had become eternal, and within that silence lay the story of an empire that vanished, not by storm or fire, but by the sound of its own discovery. The Pacific Ocean has always been more than water. For centuries, it was a canvas of empires, a measure of courage, endurance, and imagination. Men vanished beneath its waves, believing they were entering eternity itself. But after 1945, the ocean was never the same. The war had turned it from mystery into mechanism. The same waves that once carried explorers and warriors now carried frequencies, signals, and data. The sound of propellers and sonar replaced the songs of wind and tide. What had been unknowable became charted, graphed, and monitored. The Japanese submariners of 1944 were among the last to believe the sea could still be conquered by will alone. They descended into darkness armed with faith and skill, only to find the ocean listening back, a mirror held by a new kind of enemy. Their defeat marked something far larger than the fall of an empire. It was the end of an era, the death of invisibility itself. For the United States, the triumph was not of power, but of perception. Through science and collaboration, it had learned to hear the world, to map the silence, and from that moment onward, every submarine, every fleet, every ocean crossing would move through a space no longer free, but observed. In the decades that followed, the hum of machines beneath the waves became the rhythm of a new age. The Cold War's listening stations, the sonar arrays of the deep, the endless surveillance of the sea. It all began with those small, blinking buoys in the dark. The Japanese crews who first found them could not have known that they were witnessing the birth of the modern world, a world where war would be fought not by who struck hardest, but by who heard first. The sea is still vast, still silent, but it no longer belongs to those who sail upon it. It belongs to those who can listen. And somewhere, deep beneath the waves, the echoes of that revelation still drift, faint, rhythmic, eternal, the sound of an empire disappearing into the silence it once called its own.